Hello and welcome to yet another commentary from King's Comments, and today we're going to be discussing the past, present, and future of this Ukraine-Russia war. And it's just been a terrible situation on the battlefield, and this misery continues. And the misery right now is obviously on the Ukrainian side substantively more. When we talk about the past, we can't forget that June 5th of 2023 was a very important date because that was the beginning of the Ukrainian much talked about counteroffensive. They put out this unique video in Ukraine where you see several Ukrainian soldiers putting fingers by their mouth going shush as a sort of way of saying that the counteroffensive is happening, but as far as the details of it, we're keeping it all quiet. Nonetheless, this particular counteroffensive failed miserably, and unfortunately, all of the members that actually participated in that video have long since passed away. They've died on the battlefield. The Ukrainian casualties from this encounter, from this engagement, which sets the tone for the present day situation that they're in. They lost their best trained soldiers, Western trained soldiers. They lost close to 200,000 men killed and wounded, 800 tanks in what turned out to be a tank graveyard for some of the best Western armor the world's ever seen, and 2,400 pieces of equipment, artillery pieces and the like. These were massive losses on a scale that, that only World War II defeats in modern combat history. These are massive losses, and Ukraine has never been able to realistically come back from that. And the reason for that is simply put, this particular counteroffensive had meager gains, and those meager gains specifically were in the southern part of the front line, in the Zaporozhye region, where they were able to take Robotino and to be able to take certain towns and villages along the way. But one of the biggest problems that they had was that they were never able. Their stated goal was to take Crimea. I mean, there were generals in the United States talking about how they were going to retake Crimea. They never even made it past the third line of defense. They never even made it past the third line, and only stared at it briefly because they were all decimated. The Russian helicopters, artillery, Russian jets just basically had a field day with this armor coming across in plain sight. And this is, I think, even before the use of FPV drones in high quantity when this counteroffensive was started. So it just goes to show you that this was ill-conceived. And it's sort of sad watching that video today to see that all of those men are no longer with us in the land of the living. Now, this takes us to the present day situation on the battlefield. And where we're at right now is we're in a dire situation for the Ukrainian army. And I talked about manpower being a very, very, very important issue. So let's just talk about the manpower situation for a moment. At the beginning of this war in 2022, the Ukrainian military was somewhere in the range of around 750,000 men and up. And that includes reservists. Because of what happened during the beginning stages of the war and what's happened with the counteroffensive, the battles at Mariupol and such, Ukrainian losses right now put their military somewhere in the range of around 200,000 men. And these are their best trained soldiers. But there's a huge problem that's being created, and the problem is that with the lack of manpower, they're unable to deal with the Russian offensive that's taking place in a very measured way. So I use the word measured to describe the Russian offensive, and I'll tell you why I use that word measured. The Russian offensive is basically an offensive where they're not using full-scale divisions to come in and wreak havoc on Ukrainian lines. What we're seeing is brigade-size units coming in and taking villages. They're using tanks, armored personnel carriers, and they're clearing out trenches, and they're doing it in a way that sort of limits their ability or inability, I should say, to deal with casualties. The Russians are concerned about casualties, make no mistake of that, and they are taking casualties. But those casualties are significantly lower than the Ukrainian casualties simply because of the huge disparity in artillery and the huge disparity in destruction of artillery pieces that's taking place on the Ukrainian side. I mentioned earlier that the Ukrainians' inability to deal with air support, inability to deal with the obvious material deficiencies. This war is being won basically through artillery, FPV drone operators, and it's also being won directly through innovation in certain kinds of tank warfare and tank protection. We mentioned some time back about these turtle tanks that the Russians have designed that have been able to deal with the FPV drones very easily and allow for their personnel carriers to have cover so that they can put their soldiers into an area to deal effectively with what are basically people on the Ukrainian side that haven't had an ability to rotate out of the line. So I want people to stop and think that many of the Ukrainian brigades, or cobbled brigades right now, are men that have seen combat for 2 years, have not been pulled off the line because there's a manpower shortage, and who are likely shell-shocked because of the amount of shelling that's going on, and who are also likely losing morale very quickly because they see a lot of the corruption, a lot of the bad judgment decisions that their military high command and officers are making. And so what we're seeing all along the front, from the Kupiansk direction all the way down through the Donetsk region, is we're seeing just Russian advances, measured advances, where they're taking over villages, and they're now threatening major supply depots right now in certain areas of the point of contact that are really, really important to Ukraine's ability to resupply all of their units all along the front, as well as in Kharkiv. So let's just talk about that. Much has been talked about in regards to what's happening here with Russian advances all the way into Konstantinivka, which is a major supply hub for the Ukrainian military. And right now the Russians are on the east bank of that village, and they've dug in fortifications, meaning that it's going to be almost impossible to get them out. And they've started to encircle, once again, this specific village, making it impossible for the Ukrainians to resupply their own supply hub. And again, this is hugely important because of the fact that the Ukrainian military relies on supply hubs to be able to move food, water, ammunition to the point of contact in different combat zones. This is going to be a major loss once the Russians take it. But we're seeing all along the front encirclement. We're seeing Russians controlling the major roads, the major railway lines. They're making it extremely difficult for the Ukrainian military to resupply itself, thus starving them and bombing them. So the general reasoning here from a military standpoint, as far as the Russians are concerned, is that they don't have to throw lots of men at this right now in the Eastern Front. What they're basically doing is they're using their military assets to full effect, artillery assets, their FPV drone operators, and they're striking with brigades when they need to. And these brigades are basically cleaning out trenches and surprising the Ukrainians with speed. One of the things that we saw on one of the Telegram channels was the Russians using motorcycles and firing from their motorcycles as they get to the trenches, making it even that much harder for the Ukrainian FPV drone operators to sort of hone in on units, because they're so spread apart that it makes it very difficult to inflict group losses on brigades when they're coming in like this. So this is somewhat revolutionizing, I should say, in terms of its use. But we're seeing a lot more of this along the battlefield, and this measured response is basically eating away at huge amounts of land to the extent that the front it keeps moving, and to the extent that the Ukrainian army continues to be depleted. Now, just recently there was some information regarding Ukrainian casualties in the month of May, and I had reported that there were upwards of 35,000 casualties on the military side. That figure has since been revised. It's actually gone up to 55,000 casualties, dead and wounded Ukrainian military personnel. And many of those casualties are not actually happening in the Kharkiv direction as of yet. They're happening on the line of contact between the Donetsk region and the Avdiivka region, where the Ukrainian military is taking the most casualties because of the fact that they do not have air support, manpower, artillery to the extent that they should. And this breakdown in command and control is clearly obvious because they have to continually retreat and retreat and retreat. Now, I would also say that the FAB bombs, Russian use of these incredibly powerful instruments of death, are creating a real problem for the Ukrainian military because of the fact that they can wipe out city blocks, they can wipe out huge amounts of land, and they can wipe out fortifications, thus turning them into a complete and utter dust. So even the most fortified fortifications are no longer an issue as it directly relates to how these FABs have been used to allow for the increase of the Russian advance. I mean, it's been talked about on several of the military channels that are looking at the war and the mappers that are mapping the conflict from a completely non-partisan perspective, that the Russians are using about 40 to 50 FAB bombs a day, not to mention the artillery shells, the FPV drone operators, and some of the things that are happening as well on the front on that side. But there's something that's brewing which I can't believe, and this is about the future. Because we talked about earlier past, present, and future. The past, June the 5th, a very pivotal date. That's when the Ukrainian counteroffensive started, and it failed by the time October of 2023 came around, thus producing the present situation. Present situation is the Russian offensive, a measured offensive, with not a lot of ground and pound, like the Ukrainian counteroffensive was. It's been a very measured response, and it's worked effectively along all the points of contact. But the future situation is even scarier. the Ukrainians want to look good for their Western masters. There's a NATO meeting upcoming, and their plan is to engage in a counteroffensive in the Kharkov region, which up till this point, any of their counteroffensives in the Vovchansk area have failed miserably, simply because of the fact that they can be easily spotted. Their formations are easy to spot. And their armor's getting killed in the field as quickly as it shows up along the point of contact. And they're throwing men in there, into this meat grinder, and they're losing lots of men. I mean, by some reports, there was a report by one Ukrainian commander, who said that he went in with a battalion, in the Volchansk area, northern Volchansk area, and the whole battalion was gone. He was one of 3 or 4 men that was able to get out. And they're still throwing men in there. And it's not working. These counteroffensives are failing. They're failing because men alone cannot defeat, this particular firepower that they're up against. And their thought process is that if they can, send rockets and HIMARS into the Russian regions, that will have an impact, but it's having no impact whatsoever, because there's been virtually very little movement outside of Russian gains in meters, 500 meters a day in the Vovchansk area, and practically no movement in the Lipsy area. Excuse me. So talk of a counteroffensive with these new recruits that they've barely trained is absolutely the height of insanity, because what they're basically doing is they're consigning these poor men to death immediately, because they're going to put them up in these front lines and they're going to get killed. Excuse me, slight bit of a cough here. They're going to get killed. And the reason why they're going to get killed is exactly the same reasons that I talked about earlier in previous podcasts here. And that is that what the Russians have done in the entire Kharkiv region is they've come in with a very small force of about 10 to 15,000 men, if that much. And these are basically individuals or special forces. They've just added now Chechen special forces, the Akhmat divisions. These are fighters that are unparalleled in terms of their capabilities, but these are people who are dogged fighters. They're not conscripts, and they're gonna make you pay for every inch of ground. And so in the Kharkov region, in the Volchansk area, the Russians stopped on purpose. They didn't stop because of the fact that they were defeated anywhere along the battlefield. They stopped because of the fact that they were probing to see how far they could go with the small force that they had. And, excuse me, I believe that they baited the Ukrainians into a trap, and that trap is to have as many Ukrainian soldiers enter this cauldron and then encircle them and do what they usually do, which is bomb, artillery, FPV drones. And they even brought some of their best FPV drone operators from the Zaporozhye region, which is where the majority of the FPV drones were being used in full combat. They brought their very best killers up there to basically deal blows, effective blows to the Ukrainian military there. So if everyone were to take a look, for example, at what's happened in the Kharkov area, I think it would be very useful for people to take a look at Dima's report of what's happening at the Summary Channel and some of these other mappers, because they're very accurate in describing the icons where Ukrainian military hardware has been hit. And it's been astronomical, the amount of destroyed Ukrainian hardware from Western countries. I mean, the numbers are astronomical. And they've also eliminated bridges in that area, making it very difficult for the Ukrainians to resupply their soldiers without using one specific road. And this one specific road is a kill box, because what it basically forces the Ukrainians to do is to send their HIMARS, to send their defense systems, their tanks, their armored personnel carriers at great risk. And this is where the FPV drone operators for the Russian side are just having a field day. They're just killing these carriers. They're killing all of this armor before it's able to be of any use to the Ukrainian military. Now, the Ukrainian counteroffensives should be significantly more useful than they have been, you'd think, because of the fact that the Ukrainians have about 30,000 men in the Kharkiv area and likely will have more. But the issue has been this firepower issue. And, you know, the bottom line is that the Russians, knowing fully well that there's a counteroffensive on the way, will simply add more soldiers to their line of combat contact and basically repel any of these counteroffensives at great loss to the Ukrainian military. Once again, it's almost like nobody learns their lessons. And I do believe that with only about 200,000 men at their disposal, from the previous 750,000 and about 120,000 extra from their mobilization drive, that are doomed because of their lack of training to death on this same battlefield. I can't see how this turns out in Ukraine's favor or even looks half good for Ukraine. This is a disaster in the making. And I think what this does is, if they decide that they're going to continue with this counteroffensive or continue adding soldiers to this cauldron in Vovochansk, they're only hastening their own demise, because their biggest issue, Ukraine's biggest issue, is manpower. And the more they sacrifice, the less they're able to see victory in this war. This victory that they thought was possible is no longer possible. And I mentioned in earlier audio messages that I didn't understand what Ukraine's political and military objectives were anymore, because there's no hope of removing the Russians from the four regions that they originally went in to liberate. I don't see that as even remotely possible. Crimea is almost like a foregone conclusion. That's never going to happen. So what are they actually fighting for? The Russians aren't leaving, and they're not going anywhere. So this protracted action on the part of Ukraine, and this delusional thought process that's carried over in this farce of a peace conference in Lucerne, Switzerland, I have no idea what this is about. I mean, it's confounding to some of the most seasoned diplomats around the world that why anyone would hold a peace conference without one of the major combatants to the actual conference. I've got to think that the organizers in Lucerne, Switzerland, are completely out of their minds to put this thing together. I guess the United States and their Western partners put a lot of pressure on them, but we're seeing that the majority of the global South and the majority of the leading players around the world, including Saudi Arabia, China, India, they're not going to participate because they know that this is a farce. So that leaves the Western world and Europe to sit around and, partake of food. I think of this as more of a glorified meetup that they could have organized on Eventbrite. And I'm being very, very sarcastic when I say that. of course, but this is a complete farce of a conference. It's absolutely futile, because if Zelensky actually believes that the combined Western world, which is in decline, is going to save him from the fate that is coming his way, then he has another thing coming. So this counteroffensive is a complete waste of time. Let's just do the math real quickly. The math suggests that right now Ukraine has about 200,000 plus professional soldiers in their military that are being chewed up as we speak in the Kharkov area. And when I say chewed up, it's not like they're not being chewed up along the front line. But I believe that any attempt to engage in a counteroffensive against the Russians in the Kharkov area will only lead to major military disaster for Ukraine, because they do not have the ability to protect their armor. They don't have the ability to protect their defense systems, missile defense, HIMARS. If they bring those things to the point of contact, all they're basically doing is allowing the Russians to destroy them much easier than they have been to date. So what does this basically mean from a mathematical situation? Well, 200,000 men at 55,000 men a month means that this war doesn't have long in terms of manpower. The 120,000 that they've just mobilized are not the 750,000 that they started with. The original 750,000 men were volunteers, patriots, people that were willing to put their lives on the line, people that were professional soldiers. Most of them had been trained in foreign countries and got a significant amount of foreign training. A lot of them participated in the failed offensive. A lot of them participated in the meat grinder at Bakhmut. A lot of them participated in another big meat grinder before Bakhmut, which is Mariupol. This is just not a good situation. So it's a bad situation getting worse because there's not enough men to fight this war as far as Ukraine is concerned. Now, with the 120,000 being mobilized without adequate training, without adequate understanding of the battlefield, this presents a catastrophe in the making of significant proportions. Because what I see is a lot of these men dying needlessly or surrendering in mass because of the way this conscription drive was handled. Many of these men were forcibly kidnapped, put into vans, and aren't in the military because they want to. They're not patriots. These aren't people that are, at first glance, people that would be on the front lines by choice. So this situation shows the certain level of desperation on the part of the West and of Ukraine and doing the things that they're doing right now. Now, another thing that I want to discuss, now that I've discussed the situation with the past, present, and future, with respect to the situation on the battlefield, is that I am of the belief that the West is engaged in a whole lot of strategic ambiguity. And I think that the Russians are more aware of it than we give them credit for, or more aware of it than we know. So let me discuss this. The West has given the majority of its Patriot missile systems, its HIMARS systems, and they've done it to the extent that they've left their own missile defense at risk. Many of these countries don't even have enough missile defense systems for themselves. Germany now has just reached the point of no return as it directly relates to its military capabilities. I mean, if we stop and think about that for a moment, what does that say about the state of NATO's military compared to the Russian military at present? It basically means that the Russians could launch just about anything that they wanted because NATO has no capacity outside of making bluster to be able to do anything. Now, the thought of using Scalp missiles, Taurus missiles, ATACMS on Russian cities or Russian long-range targets, I think the people in NATO realize that what that basically does is it puts them in the direct line of fire. And the kind of fire that they will face is something that their own populations do not want to be exposed to. And the current crop of neocon leaders in the West have been able to fight this war so far without the general population being aware of the miscalculations that they're making. I do think that these miscalculations are being measured by the Russian military. Most recently, I think it was yesterday, the Russians had talked about eliminating American ability to be able to fly its Reaper drones and Global Hawk drones close to the Crimean area where the Black Sea is. And just recently, an American drone was neutralized. No one knows how, of course. The Russians have not said that they're responsible for doing anything to it, but I wouldn't doubt if the Russians are jamming these drones and getting more interested in doing some things to make sure that the United States is well aware of what their capabilities are. Now, just recently, Dmitry Peskov, who is the spokesperson for Vladimir Putin, used the word enemy to describe the United States. And that's a very serious thing, I believe, because if you start using that word enemy, you're one step away from a hot war or a proxy war. And right now in the global south, the United States has a lot of enemies, and they have to be extremely careful that the Russians don't decide to arm their enemies. So you could see it's completely within the realm of possibility that the Russians could arm the Houthis to attack U.S. carriers in the Red Sea. These attacks could be shaped in a way that the U.S. military is not able to deal with these hypersonic missile systems that Russia has at present. The Russians have missile capabilities that the West doesn't have. If Putin decides that he wants to arm some of these groups, wants to arm Iran, wants to arm Hezbollah, any of these things can happen, and American assets and NATO assets could be put at risk. Another thing that we have to consider that's not being considered is this growing military alliance between Russia and China. Who's to say that the Russians, who are now battle-hardened and who have an understanding of how the West works, who's to say that they don't shift some of their assets to help China deal with the United States Pacific threat or the United States South China Sea threat? I don't think anybody really knows that capability is right there. So just because the U.S., Japan, and its allies are positioned in an area where they feel that they have some measure of control, they have to be extremely careful that Russia, China, and North Korea in this particular region can fight back. And we don't know whether or not those three countries are going to be working in concert because they haven't expressly said so. So this is extremely tenuous situation in the world right now, and the upper hand is clearly with the Russians and the Chinese because of the fact that they're the two largest land masses in the world, and they're just dominant militarily. The United States is dominant with its navy, but its army is not dominant to the extent that a lot of people around the world might think. There's only about 450,000 Americans, and they've had a real issue in the army with recruitment. They fail to meet their recruitment drives each year, and this is only going to get worse as more and more people decide that that's not the route that they want to take to put their lives on the line for politicians. So where we are in the general scheme of things is a very, very interesting dynamic here that's going to be played out here shortly. I believe that this idea or notion of a counteroffensive in Kharkiv is completely ludicrous. The Ukrainians should know that the Russians can see everything because they have eyes on the battlefield, eyes in the sky, and assets on the ground. They know when there is going to be a huge amount of troop movements, when there's going to be a huge amount of artillery or tank movements. They can see all those things, and they're able to deal with those things effectively, and that's been shown. I want people to stop and think that Ukraine's best trained soldiers, and we're talking about their very best trained soldiers that were trained in Washington, trained in London, and some of the major Western capitals, they've all been killed. These are men that were well-trained professionals and patriots. We're talking about professional soldiers. And now you're going to add people that barely know how to use C4, people who barely know how to handle a rifle or a gun, and people who aren't aware of tactical needs on the battlefield. And they're replacing professional men with unprofessional men, unskilled men who are only going to die. The war is a nasty business. And what I know from war is that when you start adding unprofessional soldiers that have not been trained, this is a recipe for disaster on a level I can't even begin to say. You know, during World War II, the German army in the Soviet Union, when it was fighting Russia back in the day, sacrificed its very best men at the Battle of Stalingrad and on its way to Moscow in the early part of 1941 at Operation Barbarossa. And they were never able to actually win the day thereafter. And the reason for that, and I'm going to repeat this again, they didn't have the most professional soldiers anymore that they could rely upon, and they also didn't have the ability to replace those wonderful Tiger tanks that were on the battlefield at Kursk, where those losses could no longer be taken. And what we're seeing today is, on a smaller scale, the exact same thing that's happening with the Ukrainian army. The Ukrainian army is being decimated slowly but surely, and the decisions the Ukrainians are making are hastening that demise by talking about a counteroffensive where you've got soldiers who are ill-prepared to deal with the kinds of things they're going to deal with going up against seasoned men. And again, I mentioned earlier about the Russian Akhmat Chechen forces that have been deployed to the Kharkiv region. If anyone doesn't know what these forces are, or who these forces are, these Chechen Akhmat divisions, these Chechen forces are the most savage when it comes to armed combat that maybe the world has ever seen. And a lot of people are aware of the fact that they're the ones responsible, and with PMC Wagner, in taking Bakhmut at great cost to themselves away from Western fighters and Ukrainian fighters, where they completely decimated their ranks. So again, I'm just going to repeat this. This is a bad situation getting to worse. Again, it's not like Ukraine has a chance of driving Russian combat forces out of the regions they've already taken. Nobody's coming back to Mariupol to turn it into Ukrainian territory. So why are we doing this? what is the objective of all of this? Why are we still doing this? And I come back to the thing that I've said earlier. This comes down to money. The reason why they're still doing it is because it gives Zelensky cover and the Rada cover and the civil service there cover, because they're getting paid. And so long as they're getting paid, it doesn't matter what happens to the regular guy on the street in Ukraine who gets picked up, kidnapped, and put on the front line to die. This is about elites who've basically taken their children off the battlefield and moved them to other countries, and others don't have that same luxury. I mean, the Ukrainian population before the war was at 35 million. Now it's at 20 million. Is that due to the fact that the Russians have killed that many people? No. It's due to the fact that a lot of people have left as refugees. A lot of people have decided to leave, like the elites. Their children have left, and they're not going to be asked to join any combat situation moving forward, but they're asking the low to middle class, specifically people who might live in eastern Ukraine, or people that are on the border or on the fringe of western Ukraine and eastern Ukraine, to fight these wars that make no sense whatsoever because the outcome has already been decided. So I want to thank everyone for listening to this audio message. I would also like to thank everyone who has liked and subscribed to my burgeoning new channel. There's a lot of new things that are going to be coming out to make it that much more better in terms of the listening experience and the watching experience. But I do want to thank everyone, because I never anticipated that in a short period of time I'd have that many people viewing the channel or viewing what I'm saying. And again, I also want to make mention of the fact that these other channels that I've listened to for a long time, the Duran, Alexander Makuris, Daniel Davis, Danny Haifong, Sean Fu, Defense Politics Asia, This Is War, Dima over at the Summary Channel, and Weeb Union, just to name a few. These are all channels that people can get firsthand information on. And I must admit that when it comes to the mappers, Ukrainian mappers as well as the Russian mappers, it's been very non-partisan in its approach. And the other thing that I want to add in closing is that the Russians are losing men as well. Make no mistake of that. They're losing men and material. But the difference is that their losses are replaceable. And they're replaceable to the extent that the Russians can continue this for years on end without having to worry about manpower. This is not the situation for Ukraine, just as it was not the situation for the Germans in World War II. So again, thanks to everyone, and can't wait till the next audio message.